Good evening. Again, my name is Teresa Pella. I'm the 2021 president of the Wachiska Audubon Society. Wachiska is an independent chapter of National Audubon with a geographical area that stretches through 17 counties in southeast Nebraska. The organization mission includes bringing people together to learn about and protect tallgrass prairies as important habitats for birds and other wildlife, promote birding, and advocate for the natural community that includes human beings. You can track what's happening through Wachiska's website and a Facebook page. We have a Facebook page, and learn more about us and how to join in activities and events. So with that, I'm going to introduce our speaker for this evening. And the topic of his presentation is the diversity of Nebraska's wetlands. We'll learn just how diverse the wetlands in this state are, and which also include, we're all familiar with the unique saline wetlands in and around Lincoln, but that's just one of many that we'll hear about. Our speaker is Ted LaGrange, who has worked as the Wetland Program Manager for the Nebraska Games and Parks Commission for 27 years. Prior to his current position, Ted worked for 8 years as a waterfowl research technician for the Iowa Department of Natural Resources. He has Bachelor of Science and Master of Science degrees from Iowa State University. And he is giving up his baseball viewing tonight at Field of Dreams in Iowa to talk to us. So we welcome Ted, and maybe we'll find out if he's really a Cyclone fan or a Husker fan. With that, Ted, take it away.
Oh, thank you, Teresa and Marilyn, for inviting me. And I wish I could be there in person with everyone, but we'll do the best we can with the technology tools we have. And as far as the question on Cyclone versus Husker, I guess I could wear red. Would that help? It wouldn't. So I've been in Nebraska long enough that I'm actually a Husker. So it's hard to live in Lincoln and not kind of convert over. And my kids both went to the University of Nebraska, and my wife works there at the university. So it's I've switched over to being a Husker fan. And a little pressure tonight with competing with the Field of Dreams. So I don't know how we can deal with that pressure, but I'm glad at least a few of you decided to join, and hopefully we won't disappoint here. You can always switch over to Field of Dreams, I guess, if you'd like. So hopefully we'll keep you. So let me work on getting this set up to make sure that you can see things. Okay, anybody who's unmuted, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Yep.
All right, so yes, what I'm going to cover tonight is Wetlands of Nebraska, and talk about their diversity. And we do have an amazing diversity of wetlands across the state of Nebraska, and something that I do think really surprises people. If people drive down Interstate 80 and aren't very familiar with the state, they don't think there's much to see. But as we all know, there's a lot of amazing natural resources, including our wetlands. So again, just a little bit about myself, a Wetland Program Manager at Nebraska Game and Parks for 27, 28 years now. I cover the whole state, and I work with a whole range of different wetland related activities. So very fun job to do, and to be able to work with a lot of amazing people and a lot of amazing resources. We'll do a shout out. Grace Gard helped with some of the presentation artistic layout. I borrowed from her a little bit, and she works for Game and Parks here. And then a lot of the really nice photos I show, I have some of my own, but the ones that are really nice are actually the talented photographers from Nebraska Land Magazine or Platte Basin Timelapse. I'll talk a lot more about working with them, and we'll even show a couple video clips, hopefully, if we get the technology to work, that the Platte Basin Timelapse group has worked on. And I see Ethan Fries and Dakota Altman are listening in, and some of the photos and video that they worked on, and they do truly outstanding work. So what we'll cover tonight is basically just very briefly just finding what a wetland is, share why wetlands are important. So why do we have conservation actions to deal with wetlands? And that's related to that they've been highly altered, and we've lost a lot of our wetlands, especially in some places in Nebraska. We'll visit a variety of the wetland types found across the state, discuss, again, the conservation actions that a number of agencies, organizations, individuals, and landowners are taking to improve those wetlands. And then kind of exciting, a sneak peek of some of the new and innovative wetland outreach tools that are being developed, again, in collaboration with the Platte Basin Timelapse group. So basically, a wetland is defined by three characteristics. This is actually the federal definition and the state definition of what a wetland is. So a wetland is defined by having that surface or groundwater that's there long enough during the growing season to support vegetation that likes to grow with its roots wet and then is in soils that take on characteristics, hydric soil characteristics that develop, especially when soil's wet and dry, and go from aerobic or aerated to anaerobic or lacking oxygen. And so when that happens, the soil takes on some unique characteristics. And you see we have Norm Helzer on tonight too, and I better be careful with my soils talk with Norm. I learned a lot about hydric soils from Norm when he was the state soil scientist. So wetlands include swamps, marshes, bogs, here in Nebraska, wet meadows, playas. We'll talk about the variety of wetlands that we have across the state. So again, the soil characteristics, they become hydric if it's a wetland. They develop in areas with not much oxygen. And so again, the key is that lack of oxygen, and they can have oxygen some of the time, but is that those oxygen levels, waters go up and down, the soils dry out and re-wet. Soils take on certain characteristics, colors, odors, color patterns, textures that are quite unique and can be defined as wetland soils. And so that's one of the factors that we look at. The second is the plants. I mentioned there's a series of plants in Nebraska that like to grow with their feet wet. We have over 1,000 different wetland plant species just in Nebraska. And so that's one of the indicators. So if you look at the plant community, you can help tell whether an area is a wetland or not. And the final characteristic, and really the driving one on wetlands, is the hydrology. That is the wetting and drying. And it's obviously the dominant one. You can't have wetland without having that wet or the water part of it. But many places, as you know, in Nebraska, we have droughts, and we have long periods without much rain, and then periods of flooding. And so the hydrology is highly variable out here on the Great Plains. And it's one of the factors that really drives wetlands, but wetlands aren't always wet. And there's a couple photos here, again, by Platte Basin Timelapse photographers, Ethan, who's on with us, showing a playa that's kind of dried out in cropland. And then one Grant took on an alkali wetland out in the western part of the Sandhills in like Garden and Sheridan County. So again, I'll show a lot more slides, pictures of the diverse types of wetlands we have. But those three factors are what define a wetland. So the soils, the plants, and the hydrology, and all three have to be there in order for an area to be considered a wetland, at least from a legal perspective. And that's important because we have laws both at the federal and state level that affect what can be done with our wetland areas. So why do we have laws like the Clean Water Act that help protect wetlands? And one of the reasons is society over time has learned that wetlands do some amazing things. They can absorb water like a sponge, and so they can help reduce downstream flooding and something we call these ecosystem services. Wetlands have an amazing ability to clean up water. That anaerobic soil I talked about, there are microbes, bacteria in those soils that, especially when they go anaerobic or underwater and lacking that oxygen, that can do great things like denitrify nitrates out of the water. And so they remove nitrates, which is a water pollutant, and convert it to harmless nitrogen gas. And so amazing service they provide. And wetlands also provide food to humans and animals. Here in Nebraska, they're especially important for livestock forage production. Some other things wetlands do that we're probably have a higher interest in with like Wetchisca Audubon and from the wildlife standpoint is they're amazing places for wildlife, fish and wildlife diversity. And so everything from terns to tiger beetles will use these wetland areas. So a lot of biodiversity in Nebraska is supported by the amazing wetlands that we have. And then because of that, they give an amazing array of recreational opportunities, everything from traditional duck hunting to bird watching to kayaking, education, places to take kids to learn about our environment, just amazing places to go visit with the productivity that they have. And so if we look at the species of wetland or species of plants and animals in Nebraska that might use wetlands, 50% of our plants, about half of our plants can be found in wetlands, 100% of our amphibians, frogs and toads, 38% of our reptiles, about 50% of our birds heavily use wetlands, at least for portions of their life cycle, and about a third of our mammal species use wetlands. So again, when we talk biodiversity, wetlands are very important. And when we look at things like our threatened and endangered species, like the western prairie fringed orchid on the left or the whooping crane, about 75% of our both state and federally listed threatened and endangered species rely on wetlands for key components of their life cycle. So we wouldn't have some of those species in the state if we didn't have those wetlands present. In this slide, I just put together, again, a bunch of photos from mostly our Nebraska land photographers, just showing. I could spend a lot more time. I know we're limited on, unless you want to, I could do 2 hours like the Field of Dreams, I guess, but I think I'm supposed to keep this to about 40 minutes or so. So I could easily spend a lot of time just showing bird pictures and other animal pictures, because there's a lot of amazing things that live in wetlands. And I think many of you are well aware of that. But so that biodiversity component's extremely important. But when we talk about the history of wetlands, as this land was settled by predominantly European settlers 150 plus years ago, they recognized there were a lot of wetlands there, and recognized those wetlands, this abundance of wetlands in Nebraska, were viewed as really an impediment to what they were trying to do to settle the state. So if you were trying to farm, if you were trying to build communities, if you were trying to put in road networks, railroads, those wetlands were viewed as a problem. And they were so abundant, people thought that we would never possibly lose all of the wetlands we have in Nebraska. But little by little, they worked to convert the land and make productive crop ground and put in our communities and our roadway systems. But everything from direct filling of wetlands to putting underground tile lines in, to straightening streams. In extreme cases, things like a drainage tunnel. The lower right is a drainage tunnel that was hand dug and runs like a mile through a hillside to drain out a wetland in the Rainwater Basin south of Aurora. So just a lot of work over a long period of time went into altering the landscape. And again, at the time, it was viewed as improvements. I don't think people at the time recognized the services wetlands could provide. And so in some places, we lost so many wetlands that we're now suffering some consequences with water quality and flooding issues and loss of wildlife habitat that those wetlands had provided. So in some places, we've lost up to statewide, I mentioned, we've lost about 35% of our wetlands. The reason we haven't lost more, I'll throw in for Iowa here. Iowa's lost 90% of its wetlands, and because it's very productive crop ground. Parts of Nebraska, that loss rate's 90%. It's buffered quite a bit in Nebraska because of the Sandhills, and I'll talk about the Sandhills of Nebraska. But not only have we lost 35% of our wetlands in higher proportions in many parts of the state, especially here in the east, but we have a lot of ongoing threats to our wetlands. So it's not just that we've lost wetlands that have totally disappeared and don't function anymore. We have ongoing threats to those wetlands. And this is just a few of the major ones that I view as ongoing threats to our wetlands that we need to work to address to try to keep wetlands doing the amazing things that they can do. So we know here in Nebraska and like Iowa, it's a agriculturally dominated state, and this plowing up of the prairie and the farming historically has led to a lot of sedimentation into wetlands. So not only have we totally lost wetlands, but wetlands that are still there receive inputs of sediment that comes off of these fields or urban development areas and can actually choke out wetlands and really cause a lot of harm. So that's certainly one of the bigger ongoing threats that we deal with in Nebraska. And then, as you know, there's a lot of different invasive species, from purple loosestrife to reed canary grass, hybrid cattail, Phragmites. I throw trees in there, even though we're the arbor state. And trees have a place, and I like trees, and I have them in my yard. But in prairie and in prairie wetlands, trees can be considered an invader and can be a problem. And so it's one of the things that we deal with when we talk about threats to wetlands, especially out in the prairie settings. So we've got a lot that we're trying to deal with that can affect our wetland areas. Well, now let's shift to a little more of the fun aspect, and again, do a quick tour around the state. This is a map that I have in the Guide to Nebraska Wetlands. It's available at nebraskawetlands.com. You can go to that. That's where we host a lot of our wetland information on our website at Nebraska Game and Parks. But this map just shows some of the main types of wetlands we have. There's wetlands across the state. Every county has wetlands. There's wetlands associated with every stream and river we have in the state. But I kind of break this into playas, riverine, saline alkali, and sandhill wetlands. And we'll show a few photos of each of those before we shift into talking about conservation approaches that we're using. So kind of do a quick tour around the state. So this is a riverine. We'll start with the rivers and streams. And this is an amazing drone photo that Ethan took. I think it's a Sandhills stream, just a river, just showing the amazing fringe wetlands along there. Just a beautiful photo. And so we have amazing wetlands associated with our rivers and streams in Nebraska, especially the ones that have been less altered. And so of course we're familiar with the Platte River. The Platte's had certainly a lot of alterations, as we all know, but there's some amazing diversity of wildlife habitat provided by the Platte still. And you're certainly all familiar with the sandhill cranes that come and use the Platte River. And I read the other day our estimate of 500,000 birds might be half again too small. It might be closer to 1 million sandhill cranes coming through using Nebraska during the spring migration with some more recent counts. And then least terns, piping plovers, things that use these wetland fringe sandbars along the Platte and in some of our other river systems. The Missouri River, of course, which forms our eastern boundary and part of our northern boundary with Iowa and then South Dakota. Very different river in places. So the upper part along South Dakota is unchannelized, not being maintained to support commercial navigation. It's still altered. There's dams that control the flow of water, but a lot of habitat with those islands and side chutes and sandbars, and a lot of wildlife habitat. On the right side there is the river from kind of Sioux City down. It's maintained as a navigation river to support commercial navigation, and so it's maintained to be a narrow and deeper channel, and a lot of the wetland habitat's been lost. But then in the lower left there is just some wetlands along. I think that's on our Two Rivers State Wildlife Area along the lower Platte, where we do have naturally forested wetlands, almost wooded wetlands in that part of the state. And then again, we could spend a whole bunch of time talking all the different rivers and the tremendous wetland resources along the Elkhorn River, the Niobrara River. And then, as I've already mentioned, all of our streams, all of our rivers have an abundance of fringe and floodplain wetlands, at least historically, were associated with those river systems. So very important wetland habitats in Nebraska. Shift now to talk about the Sandhills of Nebraska, just an amazing resource, 20,000 square miles of pretty intact Sandhills prairie, over 1 million acres of lakes and marshes and meadows in the Sandhills. So where that Ogallala aquifer comes near the surface, it's expressed in these lakes and meadows wet meadows and marshes. Then there's a few very unique types of wetlands in the Sandhills. Out in the western part of the Sandhills, you get these highly alkali wetlands that have this salt crust that forms. And then we have some places where there's high organic matter in the soil, places where the groundwater has been welling up for thousands of years, keeps them cool and moist, and you actually have organic fens that form, and very rare type of wetland in Nebraska with some rare species like this marsh marigold that's pictured on the lower right. And, so just amazing, Sandhills, an amazing area. Very important for things like waterfowl production with all that grass and all the water, and also important for migrating shorebirds and certain nesting shorebirds, especially out in those alkali wetlands. So from a wildlife standpoint, amazing resource. And of course, the Sandhills support a diverse and dynamic private ranching community, and they're great stewards of the land, keeping the grasslands intact for their livestock and keeping that water present. And so the ranchers want that water and that grass for their livestock, and that's what we want from a wildlife perspective. So there's a lot of great overlap in the Sandhills, and you know, that provides habitat for some unique species. This is a Blanding's turtle, very rare in most of the U.S. anymore, but abundant in the Sandhills of Nebraska. So a really spectacular aquatic turtle, lives in these marshes, has this bright lemon yellow under the neck and the chin, and a species that we're blessed with a lot of them here, but in many states are on the threatened and endangered list. So playa wetlands, or wetlands that we have in the state where we they don't have outlets to surface water. So they collect water from rainfall and snowmelt and don't connect those streams. And so these playas get are fairly small, circular, and fairly flat landscapes that are very intensively farmed. So many of them are altered by agriculture, but there's still a lot out there, and they provide a lot of important wildlife habitat. Certainly one of the better known playa complexes is the Rainwater Basin in south central Nebraska. So kind of south of Seward out to south and west of Holdridge, so south of the Platte, south of I-80 down to about the Kansas border. We get 10 to 12 million ducks and geese using the Rainwater Basin playas every spring. So an amazingly important habitat for waterfowl and shorebirds. This is a picture that a colleague took just showing the amazing diversity of waterfowl using these wetlands during the spring. And then this is showing like a whooping crane, which use these areas as important habitat. So not only do they use the Platte and the Sandhills, but they use these playa wetlands as well in the Rainwater Basin and in the central table playas up by in Custer County. And here's some of those central table playas. This is up by probably up near Mark's home place. I think it's up kind of near Arnold, Nebraska. And so a neat area. You can see these little circular wetlands that form in these crop fields. And when it's wet, they're extremely heavily used by wildlife, but they frequently go dry up and the farmers farm through them. So very unique type of wetland. And shorebirds like the stilt sandpiper will use they're an Arctic nester, but will use these wetlands during their migration. So Nebraska, very important for kind of rest stops for these birds on their migration to the north. And then we also have species like this woodhouse toad that will burrow down into the mud and kind of sit there waiting for the next rain to fall and then come up and call and breed and then go back down into the mud. So amazing lifestyle for that amphibian that use these wetland areas. Then we have a type called the Western Alkali Wetlands. I'll actually be headed out there on Sunday to Scotts Bluff by Chimney Rock. These wetlands are along the North Platte River. The photos on the bottom are actually an avocet nesting, and the one on the right with the fence, that's not snow, that's actually alkali salts that develop on these highly alkali wetlands. So again, a very unique type of wetland that are important to a diversity of different plant and animal species, some that we don't find in many other places. So shift now and talk a little closer to home, our eastern saline wetlands that we've worked with Wetchisca Audubon on, and a very important, unique and rare wetland here right around Lincoln. Lincoln, of course, was established as a salt extraction community. I'll talk a little bit about that. And so these wetlands occur in right around Lincoln, mostly in Lancaster, southern Saunders County is where these wetlands occur. And so they're recognized in our natural legacy plan as a biologically unique landscape. That pink colored line, the white here shows where the saline soils and wetlands are located. So you can see they're right along the streams of Salt Creek, Little Salt Creek, Rock Creek, Haynes Branch, these streams that we're all familiar with here in the Lincoln area. And so again, this is up on Rock Creek. And so these wetlands form where the salty groundwater comes up to the surface in these stream valleys. So the only place you find these interior eastern saline wetlands is right around Lincoln in the stream valleys. And so they developed this crust that's just basically table salt. It comes from the groundwater, evaporates, and that was the source of commercial activity when they extracted salt from the salt marshes in Lincoln. And it supports some rare and endangered species like saltwort, the succulent plant in the foreground there is saltwort, and then there's saltgrass growing in the background, so both saline plant species. And of course, one of the rarest animals in the world is Salt Creek tiger beetle, populations of 300 or 400 total animals, and they are only found on our saline wetlands right in and around Lincoln. Won't go into detail on this, but this is from an article Mike Forsberg did on success in the salt marsh. It was in our Nebraska Land magazine. If anybody needs a copy, we can sure get you one. This is Tim Reichert, our artist, did this amazing cross-section kind of showing how the saline groundwaters work up in these stream valleys to support these unique saline plant communities. And so just a really unique viewpoint of how these wetlands work. Love this quote when we talk about the history of saline wetlands, that this is from the Lewis and Clark journals, or the journal of William Clark. And as they went up the Missouri River, they actually sent a small party up the Platte River when they got there. And they came to what I have underlined, a small river comes into the Platte called Salt River. The water is so brackish that it can't be drank at some seasons. So what they were describing there is Salt Creek, where it outlets into the Platte River near Ashland. So back in 1804, it was salty enough, they recognized it as brackish water. It was too salty to drink. So pretty amazing that Salt Creek at that point was carrying that much salt in it. Then this is a great quote. I won't read the whole thing, but from W.W. Cox as he described the landscape of Lincoln in 1861. A couple of things there I loved. He talked about it, the sunflowers covering the prairie and the wetlands, and a drove of antelope being present. We don't think of them in eastern Nebraska, but certainly historically they were. And I like the fresh breeze sweeping over the salt basins reminded us of the morning breezes at the ocean beach. And so that's Lincoln and the salt marshes that occurred in Lincoln back in 1861. I mentioned the salt industry that developed, and so they were taking in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s hundreds of thousands of barrels of salt out of Lincoln each year. We think of Morton, the Morton family, like Joy and J. Sterling Morton, associated with Arbor Day, but they were also involved with the formation of Morton Salt. And Morton Salt, well, it was based in Chicago. They actually had factories extracting the salts from the saline wetlands in and around Lincoln. That all changed as the salt industry collapsed in the late 1800s. And then, of course, the Salt Creek and the wetlands were viewed as an impediment to the growth of the city. And so in this photo from 1941 shows the straightening of Salt Creek. And so they channelized Salt Creek to get rid of the water faster. They were also getting rid of sewage water because sewage wasn't being treated at that point. So they channelized these streams not only to get rid of flood water, but also to move sewage water out faster. So when they did that, the straightened stream started down cutting, and it really altered our saline wetlands. So about percent of the saline wetlands have been destroyed or highly degraded. I think Randy Studheit's on the call too. The upper left there is Randy. Had him crawl down the bank there and stand in Little Salt Creek. You can see how degraded or downcut deep that creek is. We've talked to farmers up there, old time farmers. They remember being able to take a tractor and a wagon across Little Salt Creek in that area. Clearly you can't now. What happens is that stream is downcut. It's highly altered the saline wetlands. And then in addition, we've just had, as the community's grown, it's grown over many of those wetlands and impacted them directly. Things like Hobson Rail Yard in the west part of Lincoln, and just general urban development. The person there standing there is assessing an area that used to be a wetland that now has been paved over by an apartment complex that was filled and paved a long time ago, but high alteration. That can really be just seen here in like this photo from 1955 on the left, and the current photo. This is North 27th and Interstate 80 interchange that we're probably all familiar with in Lincoln. Actually, this is a photo from the Soil Conservation Service. It had this little polygon on here and said future route of Interstate 80. On it on this black and white map showing where the interstate was going to go. But you can see all these wetlands in the creek and all these salts, and it's really changed over time. A lot of development, as you know, if you've been in Lincoln for long, has occurred on that I-27 or North 27th Interstate 80 interchange area. But we still have some amazing jewels out there of high quality saline wetland left. On the left shows some saltwort growing on the marsh wren wildlife area, and on the right is some sea blight, both again, species that are highly adapted to growing in these saline wetlands. And there's just an amazing diversity of birds and other wildlife that use these wetlands. And these amazing photos, I did not take any of them. So these were all taken by Mike Forsberg when he was working on a project for the Success in the Salt Marsh article we did in Nebraska Land magazine. So, but I just like this compilation. It just shows this. These were all taken within about 5 miles of Lincoln. And so it just shows this amazing diversity of species that use these wetlands that are right in our backyard. So now I'll shift and talk just briefly about wetlands being highly dynamic. And I mentioned the wetting and the drying. So wetlands in Nebraska are highly dynamic. So they go through wetting and drying, they go through grazing and fire. And one of the things that shows that as well as any is a time lapse that the Platte Basin Timelapse crew put together. This is a short video I'll show, if we can get it to work here, of a Platte River wet meadow near Mormon Island on the Crane Trust property out by Grand Island. And instead of showing a bunch of slides, I thought this video in about a 2-minute period shows the dynamics of this wetland. So we'll see if we can get it to play here. There's not sound. But again, just one camera showing the seasons and year to year. So I think that's pretty amazing. That's one wetland over a couple seasons. You're seeing the cranes and the fire and the storms and the other wildlife and the grazing, and Mariah Lundgren with Platte Basin Timelapse put that together for me, and just in just a quick amount of time shows as well as anything I've seen, you know, how dynamic our wetlands are, and just love that time lapse sequence. And so shift now and kind of wrap up talking about wetland conservation. And we have a lot of different approaches that we're putting in, that we have in place, options for people to address the conservation of these wetlands. I've hopefully convinced you that there's reasons to conserve these. They're important. They've been highly altered in many places, but there's hope, and there's hope that we have programs and things that can help protect our wetlands for future generations. So these run everything from regulations. We do have some regulations because federal and state government have recognized that wetlands provide these important services. So we have the Clean Water Act and the Swamp Buster provisions of the Federal Farm Bill. The Nebraska Department of Environment and Energy has State Title 117 that recognizes that wetlands are waters of the state and provide beneficial uses. And so there are laws, rules, and regulations that affect what can go on in wetlands. They don't totally prevent things from happening in wetlands, but they do at least require going through some permitting and hopefully addressing some of the environmental concerns that we need to deal with. There's also some great things on the community planning front, and big kudos to the city of Lincoln over the years. They put together this green print challenge probably 20 years ago. I was involved with that committee with a lot of others with their planning department. I'm sure some of you were involved with that as well. They recognize that prairies and wetlands and saline wetlands in particular, streams, threatened and endangered species were important to the health of the community and needed to be taken into account as the city grew. And so they put comprehensive plans together that have helped steer development away from some of the saline wetlands and prairie and other areas. They haven't stopped it totally, but they've in a thoughtful way have tried to allow the city to grow, but grow in a responsible way. So that planning is an important component. And then we have a lot of voluntary measures that we have available for people, whether it be acquisition of an area like was done by Ducks Unlimited out in a Rainwater Basin wetland, to there's a dedication of the Frank Shoemaker Marsh that the city of Lincoln was involved with protecting. And we have things like easements, like the U.S. Department of Agriculture offers through the Wetland Reserve Easement Program, that are important opportunities for landowners to conserve and restore wetlands and keep them on private lands. So there's a lot of options available that way. This is out of the Success in the Salt Marsh article showing some of the properties that have been conserved just north of Lincoln along Little Salt Creek and Rock Creek. And those in the light green have been conserved since the Saline Wetland Conservation Partnership came into place. And I'll talk a little bit about that right at the end. So some really good work going on by partners. We recognize in Nebraska, 97% of our lands are in private ownership. We have to work with landowners, with ranchers, farmers, acreage owners in order to conserve wetlands. And so we have a series of programs available to private landowners to help them improve wetlands on their property. And so my advice, and again, we could go into all the different details on all the different programs, but I always just tell people, if you have an interest in doing something with a wetland, call us and we can find some type of a program that we have or our partners have to probably meet the needs. And so there's just a lot of options available to help landowners out with wetland conservation in a voluntary, collaborative way. And finally, there's a lot of restoration activity we do. Randy Studheit, who I think's on the call too. Randy's been working a lot over the years on restoring wetlands, like out in our Rainwater Basin. These always look terrible when they're happening. You know, you see a bulldozer moving dirt around, but here we're actually taking some of that sediment out of the wetland and restoring that wetland. And it's amazing how quickly they come back and respond, and the wildlife and plant communities come back in after we do active restoration activities. So, and something just happened here. I lost my screen share. Bear with me. Where did it go? Oh, the program closed. Hold on. Let's see if I can get that started. Sorry about that. We're almost done, so let's see if we can get down.
That's always the way it goes. It was going so
I know.
smooth.
I think I clicked the wrong button is what I did. So I think it was my fault. Okay, now we'll go back. Try to share again. went away again. Hold on. Oh, it's deciding to update Office. Isn't that perfect?
Good timing, yeah.
Yeah,
Stuff like that.
they set this when we're not at work, right? So now,
Oh, yeah, yes, yeah.
can I cancel that? Okay, it's coming back. You can always watch Field of Dreams.
Well, while you're doing that, Ted, would like to give a shout out to Ethan and Dakota, who have volunteered to staff a table at UNL's kind of welcome back students session that's going on the evening of Sunday, August 22nd. So they're going to be mixing with their peers and colleagues, and hopefully getting some of those college students interested enough to join us at future Wachuska meetings.
Cool.
Wonderful. Yeah, we've been working with Ethan and Dakota a lot. They do amazing work. Great people to work with. So, and we're looking at one of Ethan's photos. So, can you see the screen again?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. I just have a couple slides left, so we were almost there. So, so we talked about the wetland restoration aspects that we do, and this is just a photo I put together showing Jackson Wildlife Area up by Ceresco along Rock Creek. I have a pre-restoration aerial photo, and then found a photo later of some of after the work that Randy and others had done to restore that area. And so when you look at this from a wildlife standpoint, like a wetland bird on the right looks amazing, you know, a lot of great habitat, and it's gotten a lot of wildlife use. Shorebirds, waterfowl, and other species have been using that. So really great project up there and on a lot of our saline wetlands. Finally, just briefly mention that management activities have to happen in these wetlands. And so we do a lot of work on wetlands. We get questions about why we graze, why we burn, why we deal with invasive species. But we deal with that trying to manage the wetland in a way that mimics its historical functions, and to try to support the plants and the wildlife that historically would have been present in those wetlands. Finally, just a shout out when we talk conservation on a large scale, we'll work a lot with partnerships, and you're all, I hopefully, familiar with the Saline Wetlands Conservation Partnership. The team is shown there, and Tom Malmstrom's on the right with City of Lincoln, who's that coordinator, and then Dan Schultz, Kelsey Weirman, myself, and Nicole Flecktus with the city at the time. Now JJ Yost is in that position. That's kind of the team that works on this saline wetland. So they do a lot to conserve wetlands through that partnership, have a great plan that Tom put together. And a shout out to Wachuska. Wachuska was one of the original partners on this project and has been heavily involved with the conservation of saline wetlands. And I'll point out, I know you love prairie, I do as well. There's a lot of neat prairie with these saline wetlands as well. The photo by Mike Forsberg there is our little Salt Creek West wildlife area, a bunch of native prairie along with some really high quality saline wetlands that got protected there. So finally, I mentioned the Platte Basin Timelapse and the work being done by them. And they're doing some amazing work with this new project we're calling the Wetlands of Nebraska Outreach and Education Project. A bunch of different partners involved. You can learn more about it at nebraskawetlands.com. Again, if we get technology to work, they put a trailer together, a little video trailer. Products are going to be released next year, so we don't have anything final to share. But this is a little teaser trailer of actually video they collected in 2020. They've been collecting video all year, and none of that's in this trailer yet. So they're working on an updated one, and it'll rival the Field of Dreams. I do think that's the case. So we'll see if we can get it to play here. And this has audio, so I'll be quiet and hopefully you can hear the audio. It's just like a 2-minute little teaser. So that's just a little teaser. They got some really amazing work they're doing. Again, Ethan and Dakota have been involved with that. They're 2 of 5 producers working statewide for 2 years on this project. So really excited to see what what their end products look like. So huge shout out to them on the great work they're doing. And with that, I am happy to open it up and try to address any questions people might have. And thanks for your time and attention tonight.
Thank you, Ted. Those were some awesome pictures. Yes. Questions? Time to turn your faces back on and see if anyone has any questions for Ted. Anything in the chat room, Arliss?
Not, the only thing to pass on is the White Sox were up 7-3. That's all I have.
Okay.
Don't you hate going to work in the mornings?
Me?
Yeah, yes. I see, especially like that one shot where we were looking across that water and those cattle were up there in the pasture and a windmill in the back and the sandhill in the background.
Yeah.
That'd be tough to look at.
Oh yeah. No, I love my job. So I have an amazing job, amazing bunch of people I get to work with, working with wetlands across the state are just amazing. So yeah, I'm blessed with the work I get to do and people I get to work with. And I do see some comments in the chat about the audio didn't come through very well. And yeah, that it's probably just a technology issue. Again, if you go to nebraskawetlands.com on a website, the trailer is there and you can just click on a link down at the bottom there and play it. And so if you didn't get the audio, you want to see it again, just go to nebraskawetlands.com and that will get you there.
I've got a
Yeah.
question. I don't know if you can hear
Hi,
me.
Tim.
Howdy,
Yeah.
howdy. My question is, do you have enough money to do all the things you like to do, or what would you say? You could use a lot more money, a little bit more.
Well, sure. The answer is always no. We don't have enough. I mean, you know, the scale of the problems are large. We have a lot of wetlands we've lost, a lot of alterations that have occurred. So certainly we don't have all the funds we need. We have a lot of funds that weren't available a couple decades ago. When I think of when I started, the number of grant sources and programs that we have available now are amazing compared to what was available back then. So a lot of people have done some really great work through Nebraska Environmental Trust, the Farm Bill, the different conservation organizations, including Audubon, to put sources of funding together. That said, again, there's a lot of conservation work still to do, and funding is an issue. It's not just dollars to do things, it's capacity of people to do things. Is you certainly know, Tim, it's, if you buy land, you got to manage it and you got to deal with it, and it takes capacity, it takes people to do some of that work, and takes people to work with landowners or people to put together products like the video we just saw. So there's some optimistic things with the Recovering America's Wildlife Act that has been introduced in both houses of Congress. RAWA is called. Certainly, if that were to pass, it would give a big infusion of funding to address the needs of some of these species that aren't hunted, and that additional funds are needed for their conservation.
Are there areas that you would particularly like to concentrate on, or is that too much to?
Yeah, one of the things you always struggle with, and I struggle with anyway, is we have some very intact landscapes like the Sandhills, and I'm on the board of the Sandhills Task Force with ranchers up there who are, again, the task force board members, amazing stewards of that landscape. That's a very different landscape to work in. It's really like, how do we sustain that private profitable ranching to keep them on the land doing the good work they're doing, keeping the grass in place and the water out there. Very different than in somewhere like the Rainwater Basin, where it's an irrigated cropland landscape, not as much overlap, but still ways we try to find, and we do find ways to work with those producers. And then you get in somewhere like the Eastern Saline Wetlands, which is a priority landscape for us. And that's an urbanizing landscape. So dealing with community planning, stream issues become important in that landscape. So we've identified some priority wetland areas that we consider kind of endangered types of wetlands, and certainly things like the Salines and the Platte and the Rainwater Basin, Missouri River rank pretty high on those priorities. But the Sandhills, there's not a lot we need to do there. We're working to keep cedars in check and those things, but it's like you just don't want to see it. You want to see it sustain the way it is if we can. So it's a different set of strategies we use there.
So Dave Titterington, you have your hand raised?
Yes.
Hey, Dave.
Yeah, I'd like to give a shout out to Ted. I was fortunate to go birding with him one time on an NRD bird day, and I'm walking through the wetlands out north of Lincoln on, I believe it was Little Salt Creek Fork Marsh, and Ted's just pointing them out and calling them out, whether he saw them or heard them. And I mentioned to Ted, I said, Ted, I didn't realize you were that good of a birding. And his comment was, well, this is my office. Good job.
Very apropos.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Dave. Yeah, I like to be out.
So along those lines, any suggestions for effective mosquito repellents when you're out working in the wetlands?
Yeah, I mean, just standard DEET, like off, is always worked for me. I try, saline wetlands can be really full of mosquitoes in certain, so one option is you go out during the fall and the early spring when there aren't as many mosquitoes, but we're out doing an evening shoot in July. And Dakota was out there with us, was one of the producers. And, we just sprayed a little DEET. I had a long sleeve shirt on, a hat on, and, and you just dealt with it. So, it's just one of those things you can deal with. You don't want to deal with it. I guess you shouldn't be out there, but yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's what I use for spray, just for.
Ted,
Question?
what, if any, impact do all the farm ponds, acreage ponds around our area have on wetlands?
Yeah, I mean, the farm ponds are generally kind of artificial. They're built on a streamway that might have had a little fringe of wetlands. So they put a lot of water out on the landscape where it maybe wasn't as much ponded water as there was before. They certainly play a role in trapping sediment and providing good habitat for fish and wildlife. So, you know, we have a lot, especially southeast Nebraska. There's a lot of farm ponds, and they have a lot of good wetland habitat, wetland fringe on many of them. So, yeah.
To kind of follow up on Carol's question, Ted, do playas that are in ag fields, does the agriculture processes year after year ultimately affect the quality of playas? You know, they're planting corn and soybeans, you know, does that impact the quality of the playas?
Yeah, the several things we deal with on those playas, like in the Rainwater Basin. And one is that what we call culturally accelerated sedimentation, that soil being moved off of uplands with rain events or even some wind events and moving into those wetlands, and then it doesn't move out of those. There's no stream outlet or anything. So if that sediment works its way into those wetlands at a high rate, higher than natural than when it was all in prairie, you alter the ecology of that wetland. So, and that also then supports some invasive species we deal with and battle. Reed canary grass, hybrid cattail being a couple of them that are problems. And then we've done a little bit of research on agricultural chemicals, but there's a lot of different chemicals that get put on in an agriculture and an urban setting. And our knowledge of the effects of those long-term on all the different plant and animal species, which are thousands that use these wetlands, is pretty minimal. So it's certainly an area where we need more science.
Something, yeah. Dean Cole.
Yeah, a question is what is the protocol reference a landowner, John Doe farmer or John Doe landowner that wants to drain a wetland, or what's that process? What's the protocol reference that, or is there any requirements, restrictions? And then again, if you're draining a wetland, it can affect your other neighbor, all of that. What's the protocol reference that?
You're not planning to drain one, are you?
No.
No, there's it depends. I gave a talk at the UNL wetland class on wetland regulations, and my beginning was it's complicated and my end was it's complicated. So let me give you kind of a nutshell version of wetlands are protected under most wetlands. Certain geographically isolated wetlands that don't connect to streams lost some Clean Water Act protection under a Supreme Court ruling in 2001. But what I generally tell people is you should check with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers if you're planning to do something in a wetland to see if it's regulated under the Federal Clean Water Act. If it is, then if that activity is regulated, then you work through with the Corps of Engineers, they have an office in Omaha, on getting a permit if one's needed to do the activity. So deny that permit, or they could issue the permit with certain conditions. They might require you to mitigate, that is, replace the wetland you're impacting with another one somewhere else. And so there's lots of different options depending on the type of and scale of the impacts. And then if you're a farmer and are participating in the federal farm program and getting those benefits from the federal government, you have to comply to not draining that, converting that wetland in a way that would allow the production of a commodity crop, corn or soybeans, predominantly wheat. So farmers have an extra set of rules to follow if they're participating in the farm program. So it's complicated, but basically there are laws and rules that regulate a lot of activity in wetlands. There's some wetlands that are exempt. There's some activities that are exempt, like mowing vegetation, cutting a tree down. From wetland laws, those things are not regulated. So sometimes I get a lot of calls on that. Someone's cutting a tree down. Is that a problem? And from a wetland standpoint, it's not Might be from a migratory bird standpoint, a bat standpoint. There's other things that come into play, but wetland wise, certain activities are allowed, and most normal farming practices are exempt from wetland regulations. So spraying of agricultural chemicals, normal farm tillage, harvesting a crop. So people also call and say, well, a farmer's plowed up that wetland. And again, the laws don't prevent them from running a disc or a plow through a wetland. They just can't cut a drainage ditch or tile line into that wetland if they're in the farm program.
So the main thing, the gatekeeper too, is in the Army Corps of Engineers, the overall gatekeeper then, is that correct?
Dave,
Army Corps of Engineers for the Clean Water Act and U.S. Department of Agriculture for the Farm Bill program. So there is the State Department of Environment and Energy also plays a role.
okay, Dave, you're back on.
Yeah, Ted, so does streambed erosion on channeled streams such as Salt Creek, does that impact the water level in wetlands?
The erosion of the stream bank, maybe not. The down cutting, the deepening of the stream, Dave, does, because our saline wetlands, for instance, get their salinity from groundwater that is under pressure and rises to the surface in these stream valleys. And so if a stream cuts deeper, it intercepts some of that groundwater and it flows into the stream before it can get to the wetland on the floodplain. So as the creek gets deeper, the floodplain gets further and further away from that groundwater being able to reach it. And so the saline wetlands start to disappear off the floodplain in those settings.
Thanks.
We try to address that by trying to keep the streams from cutting any deeper. And at Marsh Run, an NRD area on the north side of town, they're actually doing some work with pumping salty groundwater up into the wetland to try to reestablish some saline wetlands, and that seems to be working.
Good.
But it's intense and costly to do that.
I have a couple of short
Yeah, Tim.
questions, I hope. One is, has it been established that the source of salt for the eastern saline wetlands is the Dakota sandstone, or is that just an old wives' tale?
Well, that's what we used to say when I first came here. That's what we said. The university has done some additional work that shows that the source of the salts is actually deeper than the Dakota sandstone. So the salt water passes through the Dakota sandstone, but there are some limestone formations deeper down that they think the saline waters are coming through. And they actually think, I took out some pictures because I knew I'd run out of time. I have just a saline wetland talk where I talk about the recharge on the front range of the Rockies. And so you talk about a large landscape connection. Ed Harvey, who was a hydrologist with the UNL and is now the national hydrologist for the Park Service, Ed did a lot of work with us on saline wetlands. And he found, along with some of his other geologists who worked on this area, that the water was actually recharging on the front range of the Rockies, going through Kansas, and then working its way north, and then hits a barrier in the Lincoln area where it gets under pressure, and that's what causes it to rise up to the surface of the floodplain. So it's in the Dakota, and it's not just a local source, it's a regional source. And it's pretty amazing to think that these salts are coming from recharge in the front range of the Rockies, water that then moves through the salt deposits that were put down by the ancient sea that covered the inland part of this area. And that's why we're getting our saline wetlands here.
Well, so I wanted to ask if you could give us an update on the trumpet or swans that are nesting in the Sandhills. I don't know if you deal with those or not, but are they increasing?
Yeah. They seem to be. I don't have our waterfowl program manager, Matt Garrick now, they count those and have done, recently did a study on the nesting and movements Heather Johnson was a student on that, did her work up there. And so they seem to continue to be growing and expanding. Plus states around us, Iowa, Wisconsin, Minnesota have reintroduced trumpeters. And so we're seeing trumpeters not only from the Sandhills, but also from those other states wintering and passing through. So my best I recall from the more recent data, yeah, the numbers continue to increase, and they seem to do quite well in the Sandhills. And another plug for Platte Basin Timelapse, they put a Return of the Trumpeter video together, and that's available on their website too. And they spend a little time with Heather. You can watch her getting swans out of an airboat, and yeah, a lot of neat stuff that when she was doing her work in the Sandhills.
Question?
Bruce,
Question?
Yeah, I
do
have-
you have a question?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I did. Bruce Melberg here. I
Oh, hi, Bruce.
enjoyed. How you doing?
Good.
Enjoyed your talk very much.
Thank you.
I had a couple of questions. One, climate change. I'm not sure wetlands will be too much affected if we continue to have the groundwater that seeps in from the Rockies. But I wondered, being a native Iowan, when you say 90% of their wetlands have been compromised, how do you see their biodiversity or other effects compared to, a state like ours that still has a sizable amount of them?
I mean, certainly still have biodiversity in some of their, I studied those wetlands in Iowa, some of those remaining ones, and there's some still amazing places there, just like they have some amazing small prairies, but at a scale wise, you lose habitat for some of those species. And there are certain species that need a large landscape and they disappear, from those wetlands. And, but more at issue is probably just the number of species or the quantity is much less because there's less habitat. Plus you start dealing with things like more nitrate problems, a Gulf hypoxia that comes from all that drainage that can affect, the things going on in the Gulf that can come from Nebraska and Illinois and other places as well. But so those things are affected by large scale drainage that's occurred over the years. So. And then the climate change aspect, it's hard to know. I mean, we're seeing things change. Not all of our wetlands are supported by groundwater. We have things like our playas, which are surface water driven, not connected to groundwater. And then if the Ogallala aquifer were to decline a little bit, even say a foot in the Sandhills, most of those wetlands would disappear. So, I mean, it's very fragile in that sense of if groundwater levels change. Now, groundwater could come up too. It's been coming up in recent years, but that has its effects too. So yeah, there's potential for stronger storms that could create more culturally accelerated sediment getting into our wetlands, and earlier seasons and those things can mess up chronology. So yeah, there's certainly some issues that are coming into play.
All right, thank you.
Yep.
Okay, all right, Dean Cole, you have your hand up again, and just a couple more.
Yeah, quick question. Is there any state that's been very innovative that you've been impressed with, that's done quite a work in protecting their wetlands and restoring them that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think, well, I don't know if there's one state that, I'd like to say Nebraska. So, but, and I think collectively, it's not me, but we've done a lot of amazing things in Nebraska. But, a lot of our states, we collaborate, and Iowa's done a lot of work on prairie pothole restoration. They've done a lot on their rivers, Iowa River, Cedar River, with putting land back into kind of wetland and floodplain. So I think there's some neat conservation efforts going on, collaborative work kind of across the nation. So yeah, I can't play a favorite there, I guess. So.
Okay, one last driving question that someone has? If not, then let's give